for a conversation on private sector innovation to combat AMR.
Great. Thank you, everyone. As you can tell, we're building on these conversations and there's so much expertise to be had. And I'm really excited about this conversation about innovation and access and how to bring the private sector to the table. And so kicking off and picking up on what we were just talking about with James, you know, this development pipeline is so critically important and it is long. And while there is, very importantly, the AMR Action Fund, which has contributed $1 billion to developing antibiotics in the pipeline by 2030, that's not a cure-all. And that's important, but others need to come to the table. And so I'd love to pick up there, and Janelle, first turn to you. And in your experience and perspective from Merck, you know, what is the AMR Action Fund, what it is, what it isn't, and where can we lean into now regarding developing the incentives that are needed to really bring other capital to the table?
Yes, no, thank you very much for the question, and thank you to Foreign Policy and to IFPMA for hosting this critical discussion that we're having today ahead of tomorrow's very important hearing and meeting, and then in September. You know, we were one of the initial investors in the AMR Action Fund. We felt like it was extremely critical and important that we were at a point in time where there were dwindling of new antibiotics, that even research and development was happening because there wasn't the capital that you were talking about. But this is just a stopgap measure. This is something, whereas Merck, we've been invested in antibiotic resistance and development for both end-to-end, from animals and humans, looking at this as a continuum. So how can we combat infectious diseases from, you know, the beginning to the end? And so, as you're saying, the reason we thought the AMR Action Fund was so important to occur was to give governments, to give multiple stakeholders, because this is such a complex issue. There isn't one solution. We have to look at the push incentives to incentivize the research and development, then the pull incentives to get us over that valley of death, because you want to decouple the sale really appropriate, accessible antibiotics. And so I think, you know, that is why it's important more than ever that we really think about this in a holistic approach, because the time is ticking. As James said with this new report, it shows what happens when we don't have those incentives from push to pull.
I'd like to pick up on that push and pull dynamic a bit more and understand the mechanisms and the kinds of incentives that we're talking about, and especially under resource-constrained environments, of course, that we all always operate in. And Damiano, I'd like to turn to you. When you think about those push and pull incentives, how would you characterize them for our audience, and what is effective and what is driving impact?
So thank you, and thank you, IFMA and Foreign Policy, for inviting us. So I think that it's important to mention that the report that you have, which is great, so please read it, is the last of a series of reports that have been published on the topic of push and pull incentives. We've had 10, 15 years of reports coming from independent organizations, from government agencies, from think tanks, and I find it important to mention that there is broad consensus across non-profit, for-profit companies, think tanks on the importance of implementing push and pull incentives as quickly as possible. So I hope that the high-level meeting and the political declaration will not request new reports on the topic. The time to act is now on the topic. The combination of push and pull is a consequence of the need to have private investors on the table. I think that in terms of sustainable development, broadly, we know that we need private investors to actually address some of the most intractable challenges. And the question here is how to make sure that we have private partners to work with. I know CARB-X is a non-profit public-private partnerships. We receive funding from governments and from private foundations, but we need private sector to participate and to partner with us. And our experience as well is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to have both like partners to work in the stages of development that we focus on, which is the earlier stages of development, but also to get downstream funders after we actually graduate projects from us. The consensus is there. If you see the Global Leaders Group have published a report specifically on the pipeline and access crisis with recommendations to implement push and pull. The multi-stakeholder partnership platform, which is another UN process, actually came up with recommendations that also recommended the implementation of push and pull. I find it important to mention that the combination of push and pull is not only about the pipeline and the products. It's also about the people working on these projects. And what we want is a sustainable R&D ecosystem. And the AMR Industry Alliance a few months ago published another very good report that looks at the number of people which are leaving the field of AMR R&D because of like the field are people that have been working at companies which have been successful about bringing a new product to the market, but then this company went bankrupt or they had financial problems. And I think that there were 150 of them in the AMR Industry Alliance report. And after their companies have financial problems, only 10, 12 of them actually remained in the field. So we're losing a lot of expertise. And if you take the assets and move it like from where it is today to maybe in the future, if you don't have the people and the teams behind like these assets, it will be incredibly difficult to actually turn on the pipeline again when we actually need it.
And you raise a really important point that the studies have been done, the evidence is there, and we know what to do. And so I'm going to ask you quickly a question that I asked James, which is, so what are the barriers? If we know this and we have the evidence from your perspective and where you sit and having worked in public-private partnerships, what are some of those key barriers?
I think so two barriers are related to the fact that the valuation and the reimbursement of new antibiotics is done at the national level. And this creates a global coordination problem. And this is why we're here in New York, and this is why the topic is addressed in the G7, in the G20, because we need multiple countries to come together. And there is, I think, a strong incentive for countries to free ride on the incentives that other countries can put in place. So there is an element on the fact of the importance of global coordination. There is another element related to the electoral cycle of politicians. If you are the Minister of Health today, what is the incentive that you have to put money aside to actually drug a new antibiotic that may come to the market in 10 years from now, 15 years from now? So this is why, as James said, we all need to be catalysts to make sure that we convince these politicians to be long-term thinkers instead of just thinking about like what happens in the 2-3 years coming after they may do another job. I think a third challenge is the importance of connecting innovation and access, and I'm sure that others will speak about it like in the panel, but it's important that any push and pull incentive that we have in place will have strong conditionalities related to stewardship and access. And Amanda spoke a little bit about the importance of addressing the problem in a holistic way. We at Carbex, we have clear conditions on the grants that we provide related to stewardship and access. We know that other organizations like the MR Industry, the MR Action Fund and GARPI and others also obviously work with this idea in mind, but also pull incentives should have strong conditionality related to stewardship and access.
You raise a number of really important points, and you were hinting about differentiated roles, responsibilities of varying countries around the world and capacity to invest as well, and as well as advanced different policies. Ramadan, I'd like to bring you in here. How are you thinking about this and how this issue is manifesting around the world and the work you're doing? And when we're thinking about innovation and access being two sides of the same coin, when we spoke earlier, you were talking about the need to drive down costs. And so I'd like to pick up there with you and how you're thinking about these challenges, but also some of the opportunities that you see as it relates to AMR and addressing it in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. And I think one thing you'll find in agreement across this panel and everyone else is that we do need new antibiotics. We need more than new antibiotics. We need new modalities, even bacteriophages. We need, if we're still dealing with bacterial infections using antibiotics in 50 and 100 years from now, we've done something terribly wrong. So we need to look at these new frontiers. It could be vaccines as well. That said, we've got to remember a few things. Something like 60 or 70% of the antibiotics that are developed don't make it beyond 10 countries in terms of product registration. They never hit the geographies where patients are in need. So development does not necessarily mean that patients in need actually get access to them. That's not just a nice to have problem, it's also a revenue problem for the companies, because Merck might be able to get it out to other countries. A small biotech company will not be able to, because they don't have the wherewithal to go and register in multiple geographies. So this is a serious challenge. The second is the cost. Even in the United States, if you look at the average cost of drugs that have come out in the last 2 decades, the average cost is somewhere between $2,000 and $15,000. Now, how many of you is ready to have an antibiotic course for 5 days that costs that much money? Have you ever thought of having an antibiotic course that costs $10,000? It's insane, isn't it? But that's the world we're really going into because of drug resistance. So innovation is very important, but we have to do innovation in a way that puts access at the beginning and not as a problem to be solved after we have the new drug. Now, how do we do this? What CARB-X does is one particularly good idea, which is you provide non-dilutive financing to companies, and you say, I'm not going to take, away from the returns and investors, but I'm going to, put some money into you to help you take a risk that you might not be able to take on your own. What GARD-P, which is another organization that's complementary to CARB-X, whose board I happen to chair, and which is set up by WHO, has been successful at actually the clinical stage in bringing drugs to market, not on its own, but helping private companies bring drugs to market. At the end of the day, the private sector is still critical as being the central part of where innovation will happen. But I think we're entering an era when the old model of antibiotic development, which is entirely done by the private sector on its own steam, is over. I think that's what you're hearing. I mean, if it wasn't, honestly. And in today's world, it's going to depend on money that's provided in this push kind of a way. It might be money that's provided in terms of providing access to clinical trials networks for things like CMC, which is basically another way of saying quality, which is accessible to a lot of small biotech companies. 80% of antibiotic development happens not in large pharma, but in small pharma. They don't have the wherewithal to do all of this stuff. And unless we're able to make the cost of drug development much cheaper than it is right now, we're all going to collectively fail, because you cannot justify bringing a drug to market that costs $1-2 billion, which is the typical cost of bringing a drug to market. Because if you bring a drug to market at $1.5-2 billion, you're going to need a $6 billion incentive to have brought that drug to market at all. So these mechanisms use approaches that we use for malaria, for instance, which always relied on, say, Walter Reed working with private companies like MSD, like Pfizer, like GSK, and then driving down the cost of bringing drugs to market. And if we do this in the way that GARD-P is doing, or say DNDi is doing, where you're saying, I'm going to spend $150 million to bring a drug to market, and then we have some chance that that company will survive, make some money, and then the drug will get out everywhere. The last thing I'll point out is that providing access is not a nice to have. Providing access means enabling companies to reach the places where the patients are. If you're just going to write off India and South Africa and Nigeria and Brazil, you're missing out on where the large markets are. So if development assistance, like through the Global Fund, are able to provide monies to provide new countries, that provides an opportunity for private pharma to also then access these places. It doesn't have to be a push or pull incentive. You're doing the right thing. You're getting to people who need the drug at the price point that they can access, but then you're enabled to staying in business and going ahead anyway.
Thank you for putting some numbers to that and to give us a sense of that scale and the degree to which those costs really need to be driven down. And so picking up on that, and Akhila, over to you, when you're thinking about what Ramanan just said, and also the work you're doing with artificial intelligence and driving innovation, how are you thinking about those cost issues and ways in which potentially technology can help drive down costs while accelerating the innovation that is needed throughout the pipeline?
Well, first of all, thanks for the great question. It's that small biotech is being represented, and truly almost every speaker has mentioned the innovation bottleneck and how much small biotech really typically fills that critical role. At my company, FairBio, we are using artificial intelligence in a number of ways, and I just want to highlight a few of them that are related to cost. So, obviously there's a lot of energy and potentially a lot of hype right now around AI globally. And we've actually been using this technology for practically the last decade in partnership with a lab at MIT, Jim Collins' lab. We've found that it's particularly useful for antibiotics. And that's really for three reasons. One is that you can train the AI model to really identify novel chemical spaces. And so given that that's actually the fundamental issue with our current armamentarium of antibiotics, it's really getting to the core issue. So you can train for example, we train models on find an antibiotic find a molecule that looks like it has antibiotic properties, but it's sufficiently dissimilar from current structures. So that's incredibly powerful. The second reason is that with AI, you can really create this rapid feedback loop specific to antibiotics where you can test your hypothesis in a petri dish. Very different from, for example, cancer immunotherapeutics or neurodegenerative disease, where really the models need to be more advanced and ultimately get into humans as quickly as possible. And the third is going to this issue of cost. And I would say cost and scale, all very interrelated. We can now screen 20 million compounds a day, and that's really on a bad day, compared to 20,000 compounds using fairly advanced traditional methods. So there's an order of magnitude and a possibility that we couldn't have even dreamed of before. So that gets both into innovation, but also cost. So just to give you a preliminary figure, we've been at this for a couple of years from an operational perspective, so the denominator is fairly low, but we're finding a 20% reduction in cost. But more so, the big reason why drugs, cost about $1 billion is all the sunk costs of all the failures along the way. And we're actually finding that one of the biggest advantages of our, focus on training models and really having now generative AI actually design new compounds is we're having to take fewer shots on goal. So we're now moving into a lead program with just about a half dozen programs that, we decide not to move forward with. We think that ratio is actually extraordinarily high. So I think that's what is worthwhile to watch with AI and with some of these technologies, is that the level of precision, the number of shots on goal, the cost of computation compared to the cost of massive robotic capabilities and the lab space you need with traditional methods is incomparable. But the last thing I want to say is, as you hear about all of these computational capabilities in the life sciences broadly and specifically in infectious disease, it's always paired with human expertise. The two are absolutely married from beginning to end. So we have microbiologists do the fundamental training data sets in petri dishes, and then ultimately with the molecules that are coming out of the AI model, again, you take chemists and microbiologists who look at these compounds and ensure that they pass a reasonable test and quickly can prioritize amongst innumerable compounds that are coming out of a computational platform. So our goal is not in any way to replace human expertise, and I think going back to the the Industry Alliance report, which we found incredibly motivating, we are actually trying to pull new talent into this space, and we found that it's incredibly powerful to show young talent that there is an avenue to pursue in AMR and infectious disease broadly. That's exciting. That will pull different types of funders to the table that can further your career by enabling you to hone in on another skill set on the tech side. So we really hope to expand the tent, and we found that that's been really successful. And I think one of the proudest things that we as a team feel is that it's really interdisciplinary, it's relatively young, and we have the capacity to really grow that and also enable scientists around the world to just log on to a portal where they can look at AIs, and that's really our goal in the end, is to make this as, in terms of access on the front end, to make sure that there's a lot of access to researchers around the world to be inspired to do this work.
I think
Sorry, that was a mouthful, much more than you were looking for.
No, it's great. And I think you raise a number of great points, including accessibility in terms of research and collaboration across countries to really tap into the knowledge base that exists and to be able to work together and hopefully disseminate that knowledge more rapidly around the world. And it's exciting to start thinking about how that technology also can be applied to the different issues and metrics that we discussed. And there are the challenges, and we focused on them, but I'd love to tap each of your brains in terms of the opportunities and models that you see that are working. When we think about innovation, there is hard science and technology and the work you're doing in the lab. There's also innovation as far as policy is concerned, the types of partnerships that are being crafted, and that Damiano that you referenced and others. So if we can lean in there for a moment and really distill what's working, what can be learned from here in the room and those are joining us online, what would you point to? And where would you welcome others to come talk to you about and learn from the work that you're doing? Janelle, I'm going to turn to you, Damiano, and then Ramanan.
I think, as my fellow panelists have said, a lot of the solutions depends on the country, the government, and what they see is a viable option. And to your point earlier, I mean, right now with all the geopolitical volatility that's occurring, it's really hard to even keep health as a priority. I think many of us know after COVID, people are like, let's move on and look at other issues, and we have big deficits. So it even makes it more of a challenge for all of us to ensure this silent killer of AMR is being recognized. And some of the programs that we're seeing, the UK, Japan, really looking at subscription models. That has been a key where, as you were saying, it's important to have access, but the right access and the right incentive with all the guardrails around that incentive. Also, the EU and the pharma legislation that they have been working through over the years is looking at transferable exclusivity vouchers. And again, very important with that to have the right guardrails on there. But those are two models that has been getting attraction around the world. And in the U.S., I think Amanda spoke of the Pasteur Act, which is also a modified subscription model that the U.S. is looking at.
Great, thank you. Lots more to dig into regarding the subscription model. But Damiano, from your perspective, what is working and what would you point to in terms of partnerships?
I would say that we are lucky. AMR is a very big problem. It's an infrastructure problem for our society. This is why we bring into New York and we have a high-level meeting about it. And on the innovation and access crisis, we have a solution in front of us that has been proven to work. We have public-private partnership pushing new projects. At CARB-X, we have more than 18 projects that have moved from preclinical to clinical development. At GARP, they have a product which has gone through phase 3 clinical trials with positive results. And on the pool incentive side, the UK government is very happy with their subscription model. You have pharmaceutical companies working with the government, participating in the program, and they think they're getting a lot of value because they did a health technology assessment looking at the value of the antibiotic, and they think that they're underpaying for it, for the value to society. So we have a solution in front of us in terms of push and pull. The question is, are we willing to implement it with the phase of actually the crisis that we're facing? And speaking a little bit like what Ramanan was saying, I also find it important to bring a little bit of bad news that innovation and access are not that cheap. You have to invest in these things, and they do cost money. There have been other reports showing the fact that there is a big return on investments, both on the push side and on the pull side. The estimate that we're working at the moment is the fact that you as a pull incentive, you should pay roughly around $300 million a year across different G7 countries. And this is big return of investments across all these countries. But this is only pays for success. This is also another important element that we have not spoken about pool incentive. This is money that only pays for success. If you craft the pool incentive in the right way, you only pay for the antibiotics that you want.
Ramanan, how would you pick up on that?
I think let's get very concrete. If you had, just for argument's sake, an antibiotic that costs $20 million, you don't need push or pull incentives. You just, there's enough people, enough patients to pay for it, even if it's India, even if it's Mexico. The whole reason for this is these are expensive things to invest in. So I think the successes today have come from leveraging developing country institutions, scientific institutions that provide, support. They might not do it for a private company, but they do it for public-private partnerships. We have a long history of doing this, going back to neglected tropical diseases. That's why public-private partnerships are not optional. This is the only approach going forward for AMR. There is simply no other way. So that's one. The second is public funding is important. Why? Because something like 50 to 60% of the cost of drug development is the cost of capital, because you have to go and, you've got to take money from someone in the market and you've got to pay them 25% a year or something like this. But once countries make that investment from a public health perspective, then your cost of drug development goes down significantly. A third is when you're able to leverage a lot of cross, project expertise. Both CARB-X and GARDP do this really quite well, because then we provide platforms for CMC, platforms for clinical trials, enable companies, small companies to share things which otherwise they would have had to build on their own. And in some instances, antitrust laws might prevent them from working with each other. What people might not remember, well, nobody here would remember this, but when penicillin was developed, Congress actually dropped antitrust provisions which allowed 5 companies in New Jersey to work together because the development of penicillin was deemed important for the US war effort. That was the kind of effort that brought penicillin. We're not doing anything close to that in terms of the urgency of the problem, and I'd argue the problem is as urgent as it was then. And I think there are ways of actually doing that. And I think we really have to focus on cost of drug development. If we don't do that, we're going to end up with expensive antibiotics that can't be sold anywhere. One company, which panelists know, 2 years ago, they made $1 million in their first year of business after having sunk $200 million into drug development. I don't know, but you don't have to be a genius to say that if you make $1 million a year, if you spend $200 million, you're going to go bankrupt very fast, which is what happened to that company. And the reason is they had to price that product to be so high that nobody was able to afford that product. So let's focus on cost of drug development.
I love how you characterized your opening statement there about let's get concrete. So we are out of time, but I do want to ask each of you in this speed round before we go, and not to run too much over, but yeah, let's get concrete. Tomorrow are the multi-stakeholder hearings, and from each of your perspectives in the roles that you have and where you sit and the experience that you bring to the table, what needs to be focused on? And when we're getting concrete, what do you want to see happen tomorrow? Akila, I'll start with you, Damiano, and then we'll go down the line.
I mean, for us, it's critical to have pull incentives. Something to look forward to in the future, something we can tell our funders is a way that this will all actually ultimately get paid for, hopefully with some kind of return. I think the push incentives, enhancing those is always helpful. And now the pull incentives need to really be exponentiated and collectivized and really rigorously funded.
Damiano, then Janelle, and Ramana.
I hope that the high-level meeting and the political declaration will call for countries to mobilize financial resources to ensure sustainable access to effective antibiotics, meaning new and old antibiotics, and putting access at the center, recognizing that innovation is needed to have new antibiotics as well.
Janelle?
I think I'm hoping and advocating, and I think it's all of our responsibility, that we're going to really have bold declarations tomorrow and in September that comes out. So there's sustainable discussion after September. So a One Health panel on evidence and asking for action on combating antibiotics, which was called in 2016 to be formed. And this can be a sustainable body that can be bringing member states together, looking at the evidence, looking at gaps, coming up with targets, and ensuring that we are making progress going forward.
Well, because this is the UN and not just the US, which my answer would have been different. If it's the UN, innovation without providing access to the millions of people in low and middle income countries is just a waste of time. It's not worthy of a discussion of the UN. So unless we figure out access, the innovation discussion is dead. And I think that's what you'll hear from many LMICs. We might do things for ourselves in the US, but that's not the same metric that many LMICs will use. So we really need to focus on access.
Well put. Thanks to all of you for being here and for the work that you're doing. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please
Good
now
job.
welcome to the stage the United Kingdom's Head of Global Health Security, Niall Fry,
Thanks so much.
the Swedish Ambassador on Antimicrobial Resistance, Dr. Malin Grappa, and the World Health Organization